Hello, my name is Katie, and I'm here to talk a little bit about the American Indian presence in Vermont. So to start, we're going to go back through the history. This starts around 11,300 to 9,000 BP in the Paleo-Indian period. Now, for those of you who don't know what BP stands for, it actually means before present. It's an archaeological term that was created early in the 1950s, so present is actually known to be 1950. Now, during this time in Vermont, there was a lot of glacier covering most of Vermont. It did start to retreat and melt, but the environment was still fairly cold. We had a lot of large mammals wandering through, so mastodons, woolly mammoth, large herds of caribou. We also had what was called the Champlain Sea. So this was an inland portion of the ocean. So that it was believed that the Paleo-Indians could do some fishing there, some trapping, so that they had food sources both from the large mammals and from the sea. They were fairly nomadic. They did follow the food source, so if the woolly mammoth and the mastodons were moving on, they would follow them. They believe this happened because a lot of their tools were actually made of stone, but it was not local stone, so they must have been doing some traveling in order to gain this stone. There is a site in Brandon, Vermont called the Arnold Brook site, and this site does show some signs of the Paleo-Indian period. Unfortunately, because Vermont has a fairly acidic soil, they do not believe they're going to find a tremendous amount of evidence of this period, just because it's probably been decayed from the soil. So later in this period, the climate was starting to warm. Now this kind of leads us into the Archaic period. So in the Archaic period, this is from about 9,000 to 2,900 BP, because the climate was getting warmer, the Champlain Sea actually began to shrink, and it created what we now know as Lake Champlain. With the warmer climate, also the large mammals were starting to either become extinct or were moving north up into Canada. So a lot of their hunting was kind of being changed. They had to go more for the smaller mammals, things like deer and moose, things like that. With the warmer environment as well, we started having a lot of growth of more of the hardwood trees, so beech, ash, oak, even maple trees. So they had to kind of change up in terms of what they were looking for. They maybe had to forage a little bit more. They had expanded their tools, so a lot of their hunting equipment consisted not only of just the stone, but of native copper, of antler, bone, shell even. They also relied more on local stone, so it doesn't look like they were traveling quite as much. There is a site in Salisbury, Vermont, the Leicester Flats site, that has shown some evidence of this period. They do also think that there may be some archaeological sites that are actually under Lake Champlain, because it was believed that the lake was much smaller than it is today, and they were camping near it, and then as the lake essentially got bigger and bigger, it covered up these sites. The next period is the Woodland period, which is from around 2,900 to 400 BP. So they were definitely, the Native Americans definitely had a more sedentary living habit. They were establishing their settlements near floodplains by major rivers, so they were kind of settling in the area. They were definitely relying more on horticulture, nuts, things like that. So they were actually planting and gathering what they made. We did find a dugout canoe, which I thought was kind of interesting, in Shelburne, Vermont. So they were going on the rivers to fish and things like that. They were also expanding, and they actually started using clay pottery, and later on made clay smoking pipes. During this time, the Woodland period, they did start using a bow and arrow. They definitely expanded their trade network. And there are some sites in Vermont. One is in Middlebury, Vermont, near the Beaver Brook stream. And there's also one in Leicester, Vermont. They did find a projectile point, so they were thinking maybe it was a small hunting camp. Now, some of the other history, which I found interesting because I had never personally heard of it in school, was the Vermont Eugenics Program. Now, this was started by a professor of zoology at UVM named Henry Perkins. He was concerned that there was a threat to the Vermont way of life from certain families. So he believed that there were certain traits that were maybe inherited. So he created this survey to kind of go around and gather information on all of these families. So he had a lot of what was called field workers. So he essentially employed a lot of women to go around and gather information. One of the better known field workers was Harriet Abbott. And she was able to go and get a lot of information from these families because she essentially lied to them and told them that she was writing a book about them. So she was able to get a lot of personal information. So what they were looking for was what they considered to be defects. So things like if you were illiterate, immoral, if you were a twin, an alcoholic, maybe considered a little odd, if you had tuberculosis, poor memory, if you were a sex offender, if you were epileptic, if you were considered wild or a wanderer. So if you had more than one defect, you were considered a degenerate. Now, some of these defects essentially were just based on their own opinions, because how do you really consider someone to be a little odd? Not really sure. So with this eugenics program, essentially what they wanted to do was to sterilize the people who were considered degenerate. So sadly, in 1931, the state of Vermont did pass a sterilization law. Most of the people who were coerced into this were women. It kind of varies in terms of how many they do believe were sterilized. I found some that said just merely like maybe 100, some that said there was a few hundred. Now they did focus mainly on either the rural poor, the American Indians, or the French Canadians. So for the rural poor, they just felt that they were not subject to the social controls of an urban environment, of more of the towns and cities. The Abenaki they considered as a threat. They thought maybe they were insidious, they didn't really understand their culture. And then sadly with the French Canadians, they just believed that they were inbred with the Abenaki, so they were just kind of all lumped in together. So sadly, we did force sterilization on some people in the thought that those bad traits would not be passed down to generations. I thought this was kind of interesting because, again, I had never heard of it. And I think, though it is kind of a dark mark on Vermont history, I think more people do need to know about it. So in terms of recognition, so there are some tribes that have gained state recognition, though there sadly are not any in Vermont who have gained federal recognition. So for state recognition, the Eldu Abenaki tribe and the Mohegan Band of the Cossack Abenaki Nation did gain recognition in April of 2011. Then the Cossack Traditional Band of the Cossack Abenaki Nation and the Abenaki Nation at Missisquoi gained recognition in May of 2012. So there is certain criteria you do need to meet. You do need to have documentation that you've been in the state for a while, that you have birth certificates. You could not be recognized in any other state. Now with state recognition, they are able to sell their crafts and their wares with the label that it was made by American Indian. If they sold their crafts and labeled it as that without the recognition, they would be liable to be fined, and the fine is up to $250,000. Sadly, the federal recognition is a little harder. It's definitely much more strict. You do need to have a lot of documentation. You do have to fill out a lot of forms, and there is no monetary help with this. So essentially, the tribe carries all of the burden in paying for this. So with the federal recognition, you do kind of get a relationship between government to government. You do get a lot of benefits, but sadly, again, it does take a lot of time, documentation, and money to gain this. So one of the things that the federal recognition can gain is a certificate of degree of Indian blood. So essentially, this is kind of like a little card you can carry. It is given out by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So with this, you do need to have proof of blood quantum. You need to have documentation. So that means including birth certificates, even from, great-grandparents, to show that you are essentially part Native American. But this card can provide educational loans, medical service, employment opportunities, and other federal benefits. So only federally recognized tribes can get or benefit from these cards or certificates. Sadly, some of the records obviously were not complete, and if your ancestor was not in the records, it does make it harder for you to gain this card. I did speak with someone who actually has one of these cards. It was actually someone I work with, and she does have it. She doesn't really use it. She, I think, just kind of feels awkward using it, but it does definitely give you some benefits. There are still some local tribes in the area. So a few I just wanted to kind of point out just because they were fairly local was the Clan of the Hawk in Brownington, Vermont, the Elnu Abenaki in Jamaica, Vermont, the Nohegan Abenaki in Barton, Vermont, and the Abenaki Nation at Missisquoi in Swanton, Vermont. So this just gives you a little bit more of an overview of the American Indians in Vermont, some of their history and what's going on today. I hope you've learned a few things because I definitely did doing the research. And that's it. So have a great day. Thank you.